Chair.
Supervisor Miller.
First, I'd like to thank all of those who spoke in favor and against. I thank you all for coming. And I've made a new friend in Pam Simon. We have a Vermont in common. She spent many years up there. One of the things that I see issues with this package is that we need to be responsible in our recommendations. We are still in the process of coming out of a severe economic downturn. Our projections for growth are flat. Costs are rising due to the flat tax base. We have to spread the costs of operations and maintenance over a smaller tax base. Wastewater is but one example. We're going to be looking again at another increase in wastewater rates because the projections in growth weren't near what we thought they were going to be. We were much more optimistic than we should have been. With increased property taxes, electricity, water, etc. State cost shifts we've been hearing about that we have to absorb $23 million. The potential for our pension contributions having to increase with the new laws coming into place as defined by the Government Accounting Standards Board. We don't quite know yet what the impact of that is going to be. The biggest thing is the flat growth, stagnant wages, etc. And one of the things that stuck out to me was, one of the questions I have for Mr. Huckleberry is, you have all of these packages, and let's just take the roads, for example. We have road repairs of $160 million, and then we have one of the roads for Sonoran Corridor at $30 million, and then a road out at IBM Tech Park U of A Tech Park for $10 million. Is there a specific order in which those projects are going to be done within the packages, or is there a specific order in terms of which packages will be addressed first? That's one concern I have. And what is the time frame over which these projects are going to be built out?
Madam Chair and Supervisor Miller, the bond implementation plan that you will receive sometime in probably June or July of this year will identify and program each of the various 96 projects and how cash flow with regard to bond sales will be allocated to those projects. And so that detail will be coming. But generally, with regard to, if you look on one of the tables, I believe it's on page 17, where we've talked about the biggest question is the road bond money. And it will all be allocated in the first 5 years at about $35 million in the first 2 years and $30 million a year thereafter. So that money will be upfront in this particular investment strategy. In addition, I think, as Supervisor Elias noted, these funds will be allocated for use by the board. The board will remain a contracting entity, and they will be allocated in accordance with the assessed values of the particular jurisdictions within the county. So that means that taxes received from that particular jurisdiction will be returned in the form of road maintenance in direct proportion to the taxes that are collected. And so those are really the answers to those two questions.
Thank you. Another question I have, in your assumptions, you have Pima County estimated secondary assessed value for 2020 assumes a 3% growth rate in net assessed value. So over a 10-year period, that's about, and we calculate the current years, and I think it was 1% in 15, 16, and then 3% pretty much thereafter. My concern is with net assessed value growing, that's going to increase the property taxes even with the increased secondary rate. And if you're projecting 3% per year in 10 years, that means the net assessed value goes up 34%.
Madam Chair and Supervisor Miller, yes, that's correct. And you got to remember that that net assessed value in proportion to, say, history or years will grow at a slower rate than it has historically previously, because we're under Proposition 517 control that says that the assessed value for taxable purposes cannot increase by more than 5% per year. In our estimate with regard to 3% is a pretty long-term historical trend of assessed value, absent we call the anomalies of the mid 2000s. And so historically, when our assessed value grew by about 3% a year to 3.5, that was a fairly solid, sustained economic expansion. And in the early years of this projected on Table 6, we're looking at up to 2020. Really, the assessed value this year is about 1.5% growth, and it's not projected to go above 2% for the next 3 years. And then it begins showing signs of growing greater than 3%, but what we've done is controlled it at 3% to be conservative with regard to our ability to repay the debt.
Okay, and then you gave an example of an average $150,000 home will have a secondary increase of $68 for these bonds. What was the rate for interest that you utilized in that calculation? And was that this year's net assessed value?
Madam Chair and Supervisor Miller, I believe that was based on estimated sale value interest rates of about 4%. And that's in the calculations. We actually overestimated it slightly from what it really is, but we left the numbers high because it's better to overestimate the tax impact than underestimate it. And so it's those are, again, fairly conservative numbers. 152,000 is actually the average assessed value of an owner-occupied home in Pima County. We use 250,000 because the publicity pamphlet in the statute requires us to also state that value as well, and so that's why you see that number.
And the interest rate could go as high as 8% on these bonds, right, as we go into the out years?
Yes, Madam Chair, members of the board, in the enabling question, there's two issues that I've addressed in the memorandum, and it's just the art with regard to bond counsel and how they write the questions for waiver authorization. They typically put in maximum limits, and so that 8% is a maximum limit. And the 20-year period for retirement that's written in the question is also a maximum period. We have historically and continue to have a 15-year debt period, and we will pay interest at whatever the market rate is. And the market rate just in the last few years on average, the issuances that we've gone through are 2.78%. The most recent one was less than 2% interest. And so while we think the trend on interest is going to increase in the future, it's not going to escalate rapidly. And so I think our view is that during the life or term of this 12 years of issuance, we will probably see interest rates at no more than about 4 to 5%.
Okay, and the one question that came up from one of the individuals who was here, he had calculated out operations and maintenance, which will affect our primary taxes in addition to the secondary. And I was just wondering, do you have an estimate of what the operations and maintenance costs will be to the package, to the portions of this bond that will be maintained by Pima County? As I recognize some of these will not.
Yes, Madam Chair and Supervisor Miller, we will have very distinct and specific operating and maintenance expenses assigned to each project sheet in the bond implementation plan. And I think what's important to understand is that we have stressed to the participating jurisdictions, those jurisdictions that are going to have a new ball field built or a new rec center, that they must commit through their governing board and acknowledge those O&M expenses and agree to budget for those over not only the life of the bonds, but the life of the facility, which is really 25 years. And we'll be asking the board to do the same. And so when those projects come online, we have to make the commitments to O&M because it's not appropriate to build a facility and then simply let it not be maintained. In addition, I think there's another very important component in this, in that in a number of these projects, particularly some of the larger ones, the county will not be, or any jurisdiction, incurring the operating and maintenance expenses. The YMCA was given as an example. The Tucson Museum of Art is another example. We have the Desert Museum, Air and Space Museum, Children's Museum, all of those investments that are capital investments made in publicly owned properties operated by a nonprofit, that nonprofit has agreed to assume the operating and maintenance cost.
Mhm. Okay, and I guess you answered it. So that packet, that schedule of all of the projects and when they're laid out, when did you say that was coming in?
It is attached to the bond implementation plan that will be before the board in either late June or early July of this year.
Okay,
And much of that information is kind of available. A lot of the draft project sheets, if you go through them, will have those things listed. And now we go back and reconfirm with the participating jurisdictions and even our own staff, if what the bond committee has approved gets built, exactly what are the O&M implications and cost, and that will be included in this implementation plan.
Okay, and I guess finally, on the open space purchases, when you calculate the net assessed value, did you consider that $100 million will be coming off the tax roll when those lands are acquired, that's going to reduce our net assessed value?
Madam Chair and Supervisor Miller, we wish those properties were on the rolls at $100 million. They're typically all cattle operations are operating under an agricultural exemption of property taxes. The best example I can give you is back a few years ago, we purchased Pima Ranch that was now part of the building and the museum, and that was 6,600 acres of ranch land that was paying property taxes equivalent to 4 houses in Green Valley. And so it typically is not an issue.
Okay, so 4 houses in Green Valley, $200,000 houses, something like that. Okay.
It is $1 an acre, and so it's just typically has absolutely no impact whatsoever on the tax base.
And you aren't concerned at all about operations and maintenance costs and the impact on our future operations costs on the taxpayer and also on the county, the downward pressure on the county to provide those operation costs to the facilities?
Madam Chair and Supervisor Miller, no, I'm always concerned because that's the struggles that we go through every year when we adopt a budget. But it's an issue that, again, this year, we wouldn't be talking about any reductions or any 2% or 6% or issues with regard to efficiency in operating a library system or even our park system had we not been confronted with a legislative transfer of $23 million expenses that we're paying to balance the state budget. So I cannot guarantee you that's not going to happen in the future, but those are the kind of issues that we have to confront on an annual basis when we appropriate money and adopt a budget. And I don't think that we should, ignore our investment obligations, just worrying about future O&M.
Okay, we do have the state tax debt. They pay $1 million per day paying off that debt in the state of Arizona. It's $365 million per year. So that's a lot of money for debt there. And I believe we'll probably see more transfers in the future. That's my biggest concern, is that there is no guarantee. And the other thing is there's no guarantee that our secondary, if the secondary property tax rate, right now we have a voluntary cap, and I understand the board approved this in 2004. If it were to go over that, if there was enough pressure on the secondary rate, was it voted on by the board, or is it up to the board?
Yes, Madam Chair and Supervisor Miller, embedded in the bond implementation plan will be a paragraph or two in code that says, here is the rate that the board pledges to maintain. Now, that is then the voluntary pledge of the board. It is an item that historically we have met every year, and I don't think we have any plan on exceeding it.
But it is possible with a vote of the board it could be exceeded, is that correct?
Madam Chair, Supervisor Miller, yes, anything's possible, but if you look at the history, and I've given you a table in the memorandum that says that's varied from 93.5 cents, and that's before we had a pledge. The pledge first came into being in 2004, and since that pledge, that rate has varied as low as 60 cents to 81 and a half, back down to 78, and now it's at 70 cents. And I don't expect it to change much until, if this bond issue is approved, and then when the first bonds are marketed, probably in 2016 late, we may, and then the 16, 17, or 17, 18 budget, start to move that tax rate up toward the cap of 81 and a half cents, because it's going to get there pretty quickly when we issue 10-year debt on roads at $35 million a year.
Okay, that was one of my questions, is the time frame of the debt for the road, so it's 10 years. And then you had a column on that page 17 diagram, you have future bond sales, and you had them in 14, 15s, all the way out to 2017. I assume those are current bond obligations that we have. It's the far left column on table 6.
Yes, Madam Chair.
And it totals 40.6 million. Where are the bonds from 1997 HERF? Are those included in there?
Madam Chair and Supervisor Miller, this table represents general obligation bonds of the county, and so HERF bonds are a complete separate table and issue, so it's a revenue bond, so they aren't going to show up in this table.
Gotcha.
And if you look at 14-15, that's what the recent sale has been, where we just recently got rated, and so that's already sold. And then we're looking at really about $20.6 million in additional sales from authorizations in primarily 2004.
Okay, thank you.